This podcast is brought to you by Prolongevity, the award-winning 8-week program that can transform the lives of people with prediabetes, type 2 diabetes, and many other lifestyle-related illnesses. Founded by Graham Phillips, the pharmacist who gave up drugs.
Good evening and welcome to the latest Prolongevity podcast. And I have with me today, a guy who's become a close friend, actually, Chris Knobbe, ophthalmologist extraordinaire and seed oil expert. And I've had the opportunity to spend a bit of time with Chris at various conferences recently. And I've been really impressed because those of us in the low carb community tend to blame sugar for everything. And we might be right, but Chris has got an alternative view. So we're going to talk about the history of wellness and illness and how various micro and macronutrients have played through time over the last 100, 150 years, and just see what conclusions we reach. We might reach at the end of this a slightly different conclusion than the one that we started with. So welcome, Chris. Good to see you.
Thanks, Graham. I appreciate you having me on. It's good to see you.
So I thought we'd start perhaps with a little bit of history and someone called Weston A. Price. So I'm just going to pull up that sort of initial slide.
While you're doing that, I can go ahead and,
Yep.
You want me to talk about Weston Price?
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah.
Please
So,
do.
yeah, because, I'm a Weston A. Price acolyte to the core of my being. And there's his picture for those who can see this. So Weston Price was a highly accomplished scientist, researcher, and dentist who in the 1930s traveled the globe evaluating people on 5 continents, 14 nations, hundreds of tribes and villages, and thousands upon thousands of people. As they, and this is incredibly important, as they were transitioning from their native traditional diets over to westernized diets. And by westernized diets, that means they were consuming processed foods. They began to displace their native traditional foods with our westernized foods, which Price referred to essentially as, he called them the displacing foods of modern commerce, and he defined those as refined flour, refined sugars, canned goods, sweets, confectionery, and vegetable fats. Now, those are his words. And the vegetable fats, of course, was vegetable oils. And I read Price's book, Nutrition and Physical Degeneration, and he's got a bunch of papers too, but I read a lot of that back in 2013. And that has, that's been my, the lens that I see everything through now, and it's never failed me. So Graham pulled up a picture there of some of the the people from these cultures that were consuming their native traditional diets. And the one thing that Price always found was that these people on their native traditional diets, they were incredibly healthy people. And Price was also a dentist, as I mentioned, and what he found was that they had incredibly healthy teeth, and more than around 99% cavity free. So their teeth were straight, natural, beautiful, cavity free. And these people had no dentists, and the huge majority of them had never even witnessed a toothbrush or floss or toothpaste. And yet, again, their teeth look like this. But when they transitioned over to westernized diets and they began to consume those displacing foods of modern commerce, as Price called them, this is what happened to them. We've got a picture here. You can see that the children began to develop dental decay, dental deformities, crooked teeth, essentially, because their face narrowed. And the adults developed dental decay, cavities, abscesses, loss of teeth, and they became miserable and even suicidal, a lot of them, because of this severe dental decay and the fact that now they couldn't hardly even eat. And so, but Price found then that the people developed who were on these, consuming these processed foods, these displacing foods, that they also developed all sorts of degenerative conditions like arthritis and cancers, for example, and then many kinds of birth defects and growth abnormalities, and so on. And as I mentioned, so this has been my guiding light, really. This is everything that I've done since 2013 really has centered around Price's work.
So I think it's possibly a good time, Chris, to to learn a little bit about your own history, both your professional history and your personal medical history, because
Sure.
how did as I often ask my guests, how did you end up here? It certainly wasn't where you started out, and it probably wasn't where you expected to be.
Right. Yeah. Not at all. Not at all, because I'm trained as a physician. Graduated from medical school in 1990 at the University of Colorado School of Medicine. I went on to specialize in ophthalmology, and I practiced ophthalmology for a total of 24 years. But during that time, during a lot of that time in practice, from the time I was 33, I developed arthritis, and I ultimately developed, as I got older, I was developing other symptoms, that fatigue and so forth. But anyway, in 2011, I made a change in my diet towards paleo, essentially, and I won't go into the details, but that had a dramatic impact on my arthritis. It improved my arthritis like about 80% in around 10 days. And this really changed my life. And then from there, I read Lauren Cordain's book, The Paleo Answer, and I began to understand that it's processed foods that are driving all this chronic disease. And eventually, after trying to understand nutrition over the next couple of years, from 2011 to 2013, was when I came across Weston Price's research.
Yeah.
And then later that year, Graham, is when it hit me finally that processed foods might be driving age-related macular degeneration, AMD, which is the leading cause of irreversible vision loss and blindness in people over the age of 50 worldwide. And as an ophthalmologist, you see macular degeneration, AMD, that's probably, other than cataracts, it's probably the second most common condition that we observe in practice. And but anyway, so I hypothesized that processed foods might be driving macular degeneration, AMD, and I went down that path, and that's what really changed my life. I left practice in 2015 to pursue that full time because I was convinced I had enough data, enough evidence to show that it is processed foods driving macular degeneration, and we studied that in data in 25 nations, all of which supported that hypothesis. And eventually, I went on to now in the last five or 6 years, I've really focused on the major impact of vegetable oils on chronic disease. And I've had huge improvements in my own health with my arthritis, and I found out I was iron deficient and copper deficient, and correcting those things have made a huge impact in my life.
What is astonishing to me, all of us as health professionals are born into this milieu of escalating illness, right? We're kind of aware. I mean, when I was a bit of a fat kid, but when I was in school, I was the only fat kid in the class. And now the slim kid in the class is the exception. And we've seen this escalating milieu of cardiovascular disease, poor mental health, cancer, and AMD, which we'll come on to talk on in more detail. None of us talk about root causes, right? I mean, pharmacists are trained in getting the best from the drugs. So we understand body systems, we understand how drugs affect them, and we're very good at that. And physicians, I think, are very good at diagnosing illness, but in the end, suppressing the illness with the drugs. None of us as health professionals are taught anything about root causes. We kind of just accept it, isn't it? We're getting fatter and sicker and more diabetic by the day. And America, I think, in many ways leads the world in that, as in many other things. No one questions it. And what I think is so fascinating is that this isn't actually, you can go back to the work of Weston Price 100 plus years ago, and it was all there. It was all there for the taking. And he discovered everything that we think is new news back then.
Mm-hmm.
And
Right.
what's also interesting is you wouldn't expect a dentist to be the one to have done that. You'd think it would be a physician, right? You'd expect it to be a doctor, not a dentist.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I'm right, Chris. I think he was originally Canadian, but he worked in the States.
Right.
Became increasingly concerned about the oral health and oral hygiene of patients and clients. And even then found it so difficult to find the healthy people in the States to use this as model that he had to leave America then and wander around the world and visit all these tribes and people living in what were relatively normal conditions for human beings to find the reality. And because communications were poor, he was able to illustrate that you'd have an area where the population had become very westernized. There'd be a port, there'd be lots of commerce. The local indigenous people would be eating Western food and be sick and ill. But because there was not much infrastructure, you could go 10 miles up the road, and the tribes 10 miles up the road would be leading what was for them a normal existence, slim, fit, healthy, and fantastic dentition.
Exactly. Right.
So he could learn from that, but apparently we can't.
Yeah, if we go back to, our medical training, I didn't learn what we've already talked about, what you've just reviewed. I never learned any of this in medical school. And for the enormous majority of allopathically trained physicians, that's conventionally trained physicians, we don't learn anything about nutrition, and we don't learn anything really about the history of disease. And those are so fundamentally important, and yet they're completely ignored. So just as you mentioned, we're taught in medical school how to diagnose conditions, and then the treatment is always a drug or procedure. So it's and the procedures include lots of diagnostic procedures.
Yeah.
And those are huge revenue producing procedures, even the diagnostic procedures. But then there's all the other procedures, which include surgeries. And I'm a surgeon, an eye surgeon. And this is where the money is, right? And is in taking care of sick people. And I'm not saying there's a conspiracy here whatsoever. I think the enormous majority of physicians really care about their patients, and they want to do the right thing. I know that for 21 years after I graduated from medical school, I was completely unaware, never even thought about the fact that we may not be looking for the root cause of disease, which when I look back at it, I am astonished at myself, Graham, that this didn't cross my mind. I think I mentioned this to you before. And, I'm ashamed that it took that many years, took something, even my own health problems to make me look at this. And had I not had arthritis, I may have never even gone down this path. I probably wouldn't have.
Same for me. As you know, I'm famous for being the pharmacist that gave up drugs.
Right.
And it's because I realized the drugs bill was getting bigger and bigger, and my patients and clients were getting sicker and sicker. So I think one of the things that struck me from various of your presentations is not just the toxicity of the modern diet, and we'll come on to that, but also the lack of nutrition in it. So, I call processed foods, some people call it drug, they see them almost as drugs because they're addictive. I kind of talk about them as poison with added calories. But what we both agree on is a lack of nutrition. So you might want to just reflect. We've got a couple of slides here just talking about the lack of nutrition in modern food and how it compares with the traditional diet.
Right. So this is from Price's work. And by 1939, Price had what he did was he collected samples of these foods from the people that were consuming the native traditional diets. And then he collected samples of foods in the United States, and he compared and contrasted them based on their vitamin and mineral content. And what he showed was that the fat soluble vitamins, there was 10 times as many fat soluble vitamins, which is A, D, and K2 primarily, as in the native traditional diets, as there were in the 1930s American diets already. That's how much processed food we already had by the 1930s. And there was 4 times more water-soluble vitamins, which is all the B vitamins and C, again, in the native traditional diets versus westernized, and 1.5 to 60 times more minerals in the native traditional diets. So there, that was the greatest take-home point of Price's work. So Price wasn't able to, in that day, wasn't able to have evidence, have understood evidence about the toxicity of vegetable oils, for example. And vegetable oils were in much, they were a very, very small proportion of the food supply in that day around most of the world. So he couldn't understand that, that vegetable oils are pro-oxidative, pro-inflammatory, and toxic, for example, but he knew they were nutrient deficient. In fact, that's been known since the 19-teens from the work of E.V. McCollum, that all vegetable oils, no matter the ones that, and there are good ones, but all vegetable oils do not contain any amount of vitamins A, D, and K2. And I don't care if we talk about all the bad ones, soybean and canola versus the very healthy ones, coconut and palm kernel, and maybe a very good quality, authentic olive oil. Again, none of them, even the good ones, they don't have those fat-soluble vitamins at all, not A, D, and K2, zero, absolutely zero. So you have to keep that in mind, that if you're, this is one of the things that's happened, is every time you consume anything that's processed, you're supplanting and replacing a potentially nutrient-rich food that would provide vitamins and minerals, right? And that was what Price's work was all about.
Absolutely right. And I talk a lot about this because I think most of the conversation that we hear around diet and food centers on the macros, right? Proteins, carbs, and fats.
Right.
And then about energy and calories. And I always say that our food pyramid is kind of upside down. So particularly now that we're fairly inactive, we don't need a lot of calories. Modern man doesn't need many calories. What we do need, though, is we're not, plowing the fields and physically particularly active, but our need for nutrition hasn't changed. If anything, it's enhanced. And my interest is about the nutritional density of the diet. And, the modern foods are devoid of nutrition or extremely low of nutrition, but full of calories. And there are, as you will know, there are nutritional sensors in the body. So in the theoretical case where you've got half the nutrition and twice the calories, your body will continue to want to keep you eating until you've satisfied those sensors. And that is part of it. It's not the only reason, but I believe that's part of the reason that, you could be 5 stone overweight. You can eat a ton of food, but you're still hungry because you've had energy, but you haven't had nutrition. And I think you've just very eloquently illustrated just how nutrient deficient the modern diet is, while being full of processed calories. And I just don't think you can say that enough. Of course, that's not something the food industry ever wants you to believe. The food industry wants you to believe, so long as you're taking this stuff and it's lowering your cholesterol, and so long as you're counting your calories at some level, it will all be fine. Right. And if it's not working, it's your fault. It's not because the food's addictive or nutrient deficient, it's because you're lacking self-control.
Right.
And another interest of mine is food addiction. And a lot of these foods aren't just nutrient deficient. They are literally designed to spike your dopamine, and they're addictive. And we're going to come on later to a comparison of the nutrition in foods and then the nutrition in smoking. So we'll come to that a bit later on. But I thought this slide is interesting. So, because I think we've forgotten, let me just share it. Anyone who watches First World War movies, right? The one thing that always stands out to me, no one's fat. And this is New York in, around 1900.
Right. Yeah. And the reason that, I put this photo in my book, and I think I've used it in some presentations or similar photos and presentations and video, is that, in the year 1900 or even 1910 approximately, obesity in the United States was 1.2%. We know that from Scott Allen Carson's work in the 19th century. And if you think about, and then 1900, none of those people had ever witnessed a heart attack. They were virtually unknown. Even the most, one of the most famous physicians in all of history, Sir William Osler, in 1897. And again in 1908, had apparently never witnessed a heart attack in all of his career, which went back to the 1870s. I think it was. He published his first, famous Principles and Practice of Medicine textbook in 1893. He had never witnessed a heart attack. So, and we could go on and on. There's cancer was much more unusual, and we'll get to those things, I guess. But anyway, yeah, and in those days, if we think about the diet, well, the only processed food available globally, essentially, for the most part, was sugar. At least in the United States, the only processed food available in 1865, the end of the American Civil War, was sugar, and accounted for 4% of the diet. So we didn't have the other components of processed foods, which is essentially the big fours: refined flour, refined sugar, vegetable oils, and trans fats. And the refined flours were introduced in 1880. Vegetable oils right after the American Civil War in 1866, essentially, and then trans fat through Crisco, introduced in 1911. So that's it. And then those have just escalated.
Exactly.
It's been right along with all this pandemic of chronic disease.
So that brings me neatly on to causes of death. And we can see how these things have changed over time. And I think two points really to make here. One is around the history of longevity. So when I say that we have this escalating milieu of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, cancer, whatever, people say to me, yeah, well, people just didn't live long enough. So either we couldn't diagnose them, they had it, but we couldn't diagnose them, or they simply died before. So because the average life expectancy was much less, they died before they could have those things. What's your response to that, Chris?
Yeah, that was a pet peeve of mine. It's not so much anymore. Seems like, I don't get the question quite as much now, but yeah, this is what the people who don't understand life expectancy at birth or longevity, they don't really understand this concept. And so they see that, for example, you look at United States in the year 1900, when we're talking about the fact that all these diseases, these chronic diseases, were virtually unknown or exceedingly rare. And they say, well, but the average age of death was 49.3 years, which is true. Yeah. And so they say, they assume that people were dropping dead at age 50. And I assure you, anybody can investigate this ad nauseum, and you will never, ever, ever find any population anywhere in the world that is getting old and dying around age 50. No matter how, you can go back millennia and see that people lived into their elder years as long as they survived childhood, essentially. And I'll give some examples of this, but let me throw this out. Number one is in the year 1800, Well, let me back up and say that, but in childhood death was extraordinary through history. And this was primarily not because of lack of medicine. It was because of lack of good potable water and good quality clean water, and lack of sewer and septic systems. Those alone were the primary reasons that that our life increased so greatly, because up until the early 1900s, as you saw in the previous slide, that it was infectious diseases that were the primary causes of death. Pneumonia, gastrointestinal infections, and what was it? And then I forget what the other one is, but it's all infectious disease.
It's
right?
infectious
But anyway,
disease or being killed or starvation, basically.
yeah,
right?
all those kind of things. Yeah.
Yeah.
And in the year 1800, worldwide, 43.3% of children did not live to see their 5th birthday. 43.3%. In 1900, worldwide, it wasn't much better. 36.2% of children did not live to see their 5th birthday. In 1800, in the US, 46.3% of children did not live to see their 5th birthday. And in the US, in 1900, I think it was 23 point something percent of children did not live to see their 5th birthday. All right. And in 1900, about 4% of women died in childbirth. And the reason for this is about 1% risk. It's somewhere between 0.5% and 1% risk of death in that era per birth, of the mother dying in childbirth. And so overall, because most women gave birth to 5 to 7 children, the overall average was about 4% of women died in childbirth. So just between children dying mostly before their 3rd birthday, and then these women who were, teenagers, 20s and 30s, all of them, dying in childbirth. Now you've already dropped the life expectancy at birth way down. Okay, so let me give you an example. So if a family of 3, a man and his wife have 1 child, for example, and the man lives to be 80 and his wife to age 70, and their only child dies in infancy, that's the average age of that population of 3 is 50 years. And this is pretty typical for what we would have seen in the 19th century. And now I've got statistics here. I don't have all of these in my head, but I pulled up England and Wales because you told me ahead of time you wanted me to mention this. You said it. You wanted to review this quickly. Yeah. In England and Wales, 1891, 50% of the population was alive past age 52, 30% alive past age 66, 20% past age 73, and 5% past age 85. So again, 1 out of 5 still alive after age 73 in 1891. In 1911, it's better. 64% of the population was alive past age 50, 53% past age 60, 36% past age 70. So more than 1 in 3 still alive past age 70 in 1911, and 15% alive past age 80. So this right there, that should, just with what we've covered already, we should eliminate any belief system that people ever drop dead around age 50. It's never happened. In fact, even in hunter-gatherer populations, researchers Gervin and Kaplan, way back in the 1990s, they established that the modal, which is the most common age of death for hunter-gatherers, was 72. Yeah. So even hunter-gatherers live into their 70s commonly. Oh, if they survive childhood, if they survive past age 15. In fact, even today, hunter-gatherers, I think it's 40-some% of their children die in the first 5 years of life. It's around 40%. It's the same as what, because it's the same as what people were, like essentially were in 1800 to 1850. Because that's the kind of life, they're living outdoors, exposed to all the elements. They don't have medical care. They don't have, always good, clean, potable water, and they don't have septic systems and sewer systems, and they don't have any medical care at all. so many of these children die of just things like pneumonia and gastrointestinal infections. They literally, just die of dehydration.
Absolutely right. And I mean, the example I give, just to make it even clearer, is if a woman has two children, let's say she has twins, one of them dies at birth and the other one lives to 80, average life expectancy is 40.
Right.
If you take life expectancy age 20, 100 years ago, and you compare that with life expectancy, so if you made it to 20, 100 years ago, what was your life expectancy? How does that compare with now? Probably about you're 3 years better off now. And that is where health systems are really good. They're very good at keeping frail, sick, unhealthy people alive, often with a poor quality of life, for 2 or 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
The net benefit of all that we're spending on our healthcare, and I'm not here to knock the NHS. I've worked in the NHS all my life. I'm passionate about it. But we have to be honest about where all this is coming from, what the trend is, what the root causes are, and what's the net benefit of all that we're spending on healthcare. And you'll be aware, Chris, that in the States, the per capita expenditure is far higher. It's the highest in the world by a large margin. And I think average life expectancy in the US is 76.
Right.
Something like that.
Yeah, I think
so
that's,
what are we getting for all this money we're spending?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it's, for the most part, it's not, and I'm not here to knock our medical system either. We do have an excellent medical system, but we're not preventing disease, period. We are not.
Exactly.
We physicians and all healthcare practitioners, we are not trained to teach people how to prevent disease.
So I just want to further illustrate some of these examples, right? So this is the history of heart attacks, heart disease, which I'm sure you'll make some further commentary on, Chris. It's astonishing, isn't it? Because it's the biggest killer now. You go back 120 years, it was virtually unknown.
Yeah. Yeah, so very, very quickly here, we can see that in the 19th century, between 1800 and 1900, there's only 8 papers on heart attack, MI, in the entire century, and only 2 of those were on thrombotic. I think it's just 2 reviewed thrombotic myocardial infarction. In other words, a true heart attack. So it's just extraordinarily rare. I mentioned Sir William Osler had not witnessed a heart attack in 1897. He'd seen about 6 cases of angina in 21 years of practice. You can see there, 1900, 12.5% of deaths were due to, quote, heart disease, but that was all known to be virtually all valvular heart disease, which is infectious. That comes from rheumatic fever, endocarditis, and syphilis. That's not coronary artery disease. So John Herrick published the first, that's supposed to be James Herrick. I messed that up there on that slide, but James Herrick published the first known heart attack in the United States, 1912, with documented autopsy evidence. And then by the 1930s, coronary heart disease became the leading cause of death. But what's interesting is it was unknown in 1910. And then by 2010, 1 out of 3 deaths are due to coronary heart disease. So you can see we went from 0, essentially, coronary heart disease deaths in 1900 to 1 out of 3 people dying of coronary heart disease in 2010. But along with this, as we'll get to later, you can see that this parallels precisely the increase in vegetable oils.
So I just want to be very clear with people, and I want this to be struck home, right? If you go back to the early 20th century, there were no cardiologists because there was no heart disease. And when the first known in the entire medical literature, and maybe you missed something, right? But it's inconceivable that there was a huge amount of cardiovascular death at that time. The first published case, 1912. And they laughed at him because so what? It's one death. Who's bothered, right? So we've gone from basically unknown in the early 20th century to the single major leading cause of death in our current time. It's absolutely astonishing.
Right.
And if it was just heart disease, we'd say, well, it's just heart disease, right? And yes, the one thing we have got better, we've got better at the drugs have helped, right? There's certainly some interventions here that's helped a bit.
Yeah, I think the most important thing that's helped is the great reduction in smoking. That
Yeah.
is by far and away the greatest the major reason that coronary heart disease has gone down.
But I think, I mean, maybe we won't know for another 20 or 30 years. I think that benefit of smoking going down, we've probably had that benefit now. And I predict, because now we're so inactive and we eat so much processed food, that we're going to lose the benefit of that benefit, and it'll all start inexorably going upwards. So the second leading killer in the developed world is cancer.
Right.
And again, same story, really. Now, Boston's interesting. Tell us a bit about Boston, Chris, because they had such incredible records. So this argument that, yeah, it was happening, but we've demolished the argument that said they died before they caught it, because we know people live longer. The second argument is they had it, but no one could diagnose it. So talk to us about Boston.
Yeah, that's absurd to say that they couldn't diagnose cancer. I mean, physicians have been able to diagnose cancer, for hundreds of years, if not millennia, really. They've recognized the signs of cancer. But anyway, yeah, in the city of Boston, Massachusetts, in 1811, this data that I'm presenting here comes from a bill of mortality, which are pretty common. You could look these up for yourself on the internet using images and bill of mortality for various cities, and you'll find some of these. But this is a typical one, and this one was actually published in a scientific paper. So in Boston, in the year 1811, there was 942 deaths. That was around. They had a population of around 30,000, as I recall. And of those 942 deaths, 5 people died of cancer. That's 1 in 188 deaths due to cancer, 1811. Now, we know in 1900 from a paper by Jones that 1 in 17 people died of cancer. That's 5.8%. So there's a big increase since 1811. And then by 2010, 31.1% of deaths in the United States due to cancer. So that's about 1 in 3. So we went in 200 years from 1 in 188 in 1811 to 1 in 17 deaths in 1900 to 1 in 3 by 2010. 200 years, that's what happened to us. This is a 62-fold increase in cancer deaths in a period of about right at 200 years. Again, why? But as you'll see, the whole it's processed food, and the main components, again, refined flours, refined sugars, and vegetable oils. And I will my research basically focuses greatly on the fact that I think the huge cause here is vegetable oils.
Absolutely. All right, so let's just talk about diabetes now. It's interesting because my argument is diabetes doesn't kill you, by and large. It's the consequences, it's the sequelae of the diabetes that are the killer. But and so I think statistically, diabetes is sort of number 5 or 6 cause of death on the death certificate. But when you understand the whole of metabolic syndrome, you realize this very clear relationship between cardiovascular disease, cancer, dementia, obesity, and diabetes. In many ways, they're same. My argument is they're the same disease, just played out in different body systems. Same root cause, different outcome. So let's talk a little bit about diabetes now. And
okay, sure.
It was basically unknown in your comment, but it's gone from almost everyone's got it to almost 1890 nobody had diabetes, and now the whole world's got it.
Yeah, so again, I use Sir William Osler's first textbook published in 1893, and he established from the census in 1890 in the United States that diabetes affected 2.8 per 100,000 people. That's a prevalence of 0.0028%. And that increased something like 135-fold. I think the number is already by 1935 as The processed foods were going up and the vegetable oils were going up at that time to 0.37% in 1935. You can see it at 0.91% by 1960, all the way to 13% by 2016. So this is a 4,643-fold increase in diabetes in a period of 126 years. Now, let me just say, statistically speaking, we know in all of science that if something doubles, it's almost always statistically significant. Because when you look at something and if it goes up 40%, that may not be statistically significant. But if it doubles, if it goes up 100%, then that's statistically significant. So if we'd gone from 0.0028% to whatever double that is, 0.0056%, that would be statistically significant, right? But it went up 4,643-fold. And if we get to the data later, we'll see that in the United States, diabetes is going through the roof while calories go down, sugar goes down, and carbohydrates go down. But the one thing that continues to go up is the vegetable oils. And this is what we've seen in many nations. And it's also similar, there's not quite, but there's similar evidence in the United Kingdom.
And I want to bring in another point, Chris, at this point. So there's a terrible history of poor nutritional studies and epidemiology. And a lot of these studies around that, statins and the use of drugs, they talk about 20%. We're not looking at 20% here. Was it 4,643-fold increase in diabetes? Right. You can't possibly dismiss that as artifact. You cannot. And yet that's the world that we live in. Right. That's not evidence. And the examples I tend to rely upon are how we discovered the damage done from smoking cessation, from smoking, right? Mm-hmm. Because according to the cigarette industry, there's no evidence that smoking killed anyone still.
Sure.
I think it's a 13x increase in all-cause mortality, something like that. Mm-hmm. And I haven't got in front of me the risk of all-cause mortality. So this is a very important point for me, that if I don't die of diabetes, but I die of cancer, or I don't die of cancer, but I die of a heart attack, that's not much of a benefit. My interest, the whole reason we call Prolongevity, is I'm interested in all-cause mortality. In other words, what's my risk of dying of anything in the next year, 10 years, whatever?
Right.
And we've seen this massive increase in all these different causes of mortality we've just illustrated 126 years. So,
but people have an astounding ability to deny evidence. You can show them, you can show them the most massive amount of evidence, and they will ignore it because of preconceived notions or ego or shame or whatever, because they've been defending a hypothesis that they believe in, for example. Yeah. So there's many reasons, but people deny evidence all the time, and no matter how much evidence you show people, I've seen this over and over, for many years now, they will deny this. You want me to talk about this obesity in the United States?
I do in the following sense, that I don't think obesity is, generally speaking, a root cause.
No, I agree.
I think obesity is a symptom of what else is going on from a cardiometabolic system. Now, obviously, being morbidly obese is not healthy for anyone. But it is the case that you can be overweight and perfectly healthy, and it's also the case that you could be slim and sick. Right. And I think this gets hugely distorted. So I don't want to lead, and all the newspaper headlines. There's even more currently with the latest thing is Wegovy, and all these new drugs that are going to help you lose weight. There's an obsession. I think people look for simple answers to complex questions, and the obsession is with obesity. So I just want to put some context that, yes, we've seen this incredible growth in obesity, and yes, it's not good. But I think this is something that tracks with cardiometabolic disease, but it's probably not causative in the main. I don't know whether you share my perspective or you've got a different perspective on it.
No, I agree with you 100%, Graham. I do not believe that overweight or obesity are the cause of most any of our chronic diseases. I believe that obesity runs with these diseases because they're all caused by the same thing, which is processed foods and particularly vegetable oils. Again, and because that's what the evidence shows. So yeah, I completely agree with you. And I don't know if you wanted to go over those, if you want me to go over those statistics. I mean, I know them in my head if you want me to mention this. So again, but yeah, I mentioned earlier that obesity in the United States was 1.2% in the 19th century. And that was Scott Allen Carson's work. That comes from men that were imprisoned ages 18 to 80 in the United States from multiple states, mostly Texas and Nebraska. So that's where that data came from. But you can look at photos and video from around 1900, 1910, and you can see that obesity or even overweight was very rare. You can see that it was about 1%. You can just watch these videos. And but you know, by 1960, obesity in the United States was 13%. And this is when people think, well, you know, we didn't have any problems. We were healthy and we were lean and slim and all that. But guess what? Obesity had already risen 11-fold between the 19th century and 1960. And today, by 2018, obesity sits at 42.5%, with another 31.1% of Americans overweight. That's a total of, it's around 74% of Americans now either overweight or obese. So 3/4 of us essentially overweight or obese.
And we're not far behind our American cousins, I can assure you.
Right. Yeah.
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 So
I have that data here too.
I think, well, let's talk. If you've got it in front of you, let's talk about it. It's a good time to talk about it.
So, or we can talk about it in relation to vegetable oils if you want to do that. But I can tell you already that just between 1980 and 2019, obesity in the United Kingdom elevated from 7% in 1980 to 28% in 2019. So elevated 4-fold. Right now, I don't have the numbers handy for the overweight. That's the obese category, right? Up to 28%. And diabetes tripled just between 1995 and 2018, increased from 2.5% to 7.5%. And this is during the same time that sugar has been going down. So sugar has been going down in the United Kingdom since 1961. And it's leveled off in recent years, but there's been a downward trend essentially that whole time. But the one thing that's going up is the vegetable oils. It's the one thing that's going up in almost all nations
everywhere
worldwide is vegetable oils. Vegetable oils are supplanting and replacing animal fats, lard, butter, and beef tallow, essentially, and even replacing other natural fats like just fats from olive oil or avocados or even those kind of plant fats, even coconut oil or avocado oil, for example.
And I want to frame some context here, because until I learned more from you and others about seed oils, I likewise assumed that it was all fairly good until the 1960s. And yes, there's certainly been an acceleration in the last sort of 40, 60 years, but the problem actually began in the early 20th century. Mm-hmm. And what is the coincidence between the introduction of seed oils and the beginnings of obesity, compared with the trajectory of sugar and carbs in the diet?
Where, Graham? Like in the United States?
Yeah, I mean, just worldwide. We can talk globally, can't we, about seed oils were first introduced into the diet in the early 19th century?
So that it's a complex question because if we can look at some, a very broad view, for example, there was no seed oils in the United States up through the American Civil War, which ended in 1865.
Yeah.
And so then right after the American Civil War, we got cottonseed oil.
Yeah.
And it was very low consumption, just about essentially ballpark 1 to 2 grams a day total oils, which was mostly cottonseed oil and tiny amounts of olive oil up through 1909. And then we got soybean oil in 1909. And then all the others came after that, soybean, corn, canola, cottonseed, rapeseed, grapeseed, sunflower, safflower, rice bran, sesame, peanut oils, all of those, which are the highly polyunsaturated oils, all of those followed. So in 1909, we were around 9 grams a day. By 1961, we were at 19.5 grams a day. And by 2010, we were in the United States 80.5 grams per person per day. So that's like 720 calories worth. It's 32% of US caloric intake. So we went from 0% of US caloric intake in 1865 to close to a third of the diet. Somewhere between a fourth and a third of the diet in the United States is seed oil, vegetable oils.
Yeah.
Globally, the situation is similar. And the situation is pretty similar for the UK. We only have data going back to 1940 in the UK on vegetable oils.
Yeah.
But the situation is similar, except the numbers are a lot smaller in terms of the vegetable oil consumption. Globally, the situation is very similar to the US. There was virtually almost zero consumption in 1865 worldwide. And by 2010, I believe it was, we're at an average around 65 grams per person per day of total vegetable oils. Now, some of those are good oils, but better oils. I don't think any of them are as good as the natural animal fats. But anyway, that's really what's happened. And let me give you another couple of statistics. Just between 1963 and 2003, in this 40-year period, vegetable oils doubled in developing countries worldwide. In that same period, 1963 to 2003, vegetable oils tripled in developing countries.
Yeah.
And along with this, at the exact same time, we've seen between 1975 and 2014, obesity, I wish I had these, I think I have these numbers here somewhere, but obesity increased, here we go, in men from 3.2% in 1975 globally to 10.8%. So it more than tripled, all right, globally. Obesity in women in 1975 was 6.4%, increased to 14.9%. Again, in parallel with the vegetable oil increase, which, during that period, vegetable oils, let me just say this too. During this period, sugars went up 5% globally. Vegetable oil went up 85%. In other words, it almost doubled. And then we can talk about diabetes went up during this approximate same period. It was 1980 on diabetes increased from 4.3% that year, 1980, to 9% in 2014 globally again. And then diabetes in women increased from 4% in 1980 to 7.9%. So it doubled as well, right? And again, the numbers are the same, but the sugars went up around 5%. I take it back. During that period, 1980 to 2014, sugars are down 1.7%. Carbohydrates are slightly down around 1%. And the vegetable oils up 55% during that period. So they went up 1.55 fold between 1980 and 2014. So, and you can do the same thing with the body mass index. You know, we're up several points in body mass index globally. Again, in parallel with vegetable oils.
So I want to talk about your specialism a bit, AMD.
Okay.
Because I think it illustrates so much about the history, but also it translates into cardiometabolic disease and mechanisms as well.
So, well, here we go. For those who can see the slide here. So when I began to research macular degeneration, you know, the belief system about age-related macular degeneration, which again is abbreviated AMD, and it is the leading cause of irreversible vision loss and blindness in people over the age of 50 worldwide. And when I began to research this, when I hypothesized that processed foods are driving macular degeneration, I had to investigate the history because for the most part, it had almost never been done. Almost only one other researcher had ever done this in the world, and I never found his paper until after I'd done all my research. But anyway, between 1851, when macular degeneration was first discoverable because of the publication of the design of the ophthalmoscope, where you could look into the back of the eye, look into the retina. Yeah, there we go. There's a picture of it. This was the Hermann von Helmholtz ophthalmoscope, which he published in a little book in 1851. It was released, I believe, and so then, and within, you know, this technology spread around the world within a decade. So the ophthalmoscope was in use all around the world by 1860, and in 1850s, much, you know, research and evidence had already been done on looking in the retina. But anyway, so between 1851, when you could first diagnose macular degeneration, until 1930, there's no more than about 50 cases of macular degeneration in all the world's literature in that 80-year period. Yet today, in 2020, there was 196 million cases of macular degeneration globally, and that number is expected to be 288 million by 2040. And for those over age 75, it is about 1 in 3 people affected with AMD. That's, you know, about 29%. And it's very similar to the history of Alzheimer's, you know, that, you know, where it was just extraordinary. It was unknown in the 19th century, essentially. But yeah, so and if you can see the picture, you can see the macula, the central retina there with the and here's a picture of just the macula, which is the central retina accounts for for your central vision. So when you're looking at somebody's face or a stop sign or whatever, that lands on your macula. But this is the area of the eye that tends to degenerate with, quote, with age. And it's not because of aging, is what I would submit, and not at all. It's because of processed foods, and our data in 25 nations supports this evidence that is, again, primarily driven by vegetable oils, but processed foods in general are the big drivers of this.
So we've had there's yet another illness that was virtually unknown, and now is the third major. It's the leading cause of blindness.
Yes, of irreversible blindness.
Absolutely. And if you don't buy any of our other arguments around our ability or not of being able to diagnose all these other illnesses, I'd like to know what the argument is here, because in a very basic way, you could look in the back of an eye, and the ophthalmoscope was, I think, invented around 1850 and quite refined within 10 years, and it was available worldwide. And yet there are no cases, and Chris has done this. I've read Chris's first book around the history of this, and Chris has researched the world's literature for cases of AMD and the history of it, which I think you did that, and then you've moved on to the other diseases, and they all track together. But it's frightening but fascinating in equal measure that this simple device was available. All you need to do is look in the back of the eye, and this is what you would be seeing. So let's just very briefly talk about, I don't want to go into the molecular detail here, but perhaps you'll say a little bit about what actually happens, because it mirrors to me quite closely cardiovascular disease.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's going to be hard to explain this in a nutshell, but let me just say that the major things that happen in macular degeneration does parallel cardiovascular disease, because if I don't know if you can see this image, but I'll try to explain it. But from the outside in, you've got this in the eye, the layers of the eye. You've got the sclera, and then the choriocapillaris, which is the vascular layer, and then Bruch's membrane, which is sort of almost a cartilaginous-like membrane, and then the RPE, retinal pigment epithelium, and then the photoreceptors, which is the rods and cones. And in macular degeneration, yeah, multiple things happen. Number one is you can have dropout of the choriocapillaris, which means that it atrophies. It actually sort of becomes occluded or atrophies away. Bruch's membrane thickens and calcifies, very similar to an atherosclerotic plaque, like in a coronary artery, that they are analogous. And then what happens is then you can't get, then the blood flow, because of, in part because of this thickened membrane, can't supply the retinal pigment epithelium, and the RPE, the retinal pigment epithelium, each one of those cells supplies nutrients and oxygen to the photoreceptors, the rods and cones. And so each RPE cell supplies about 30 photoreceptors. So the RPE actually then atrophies in this disease for the most part. I'm talking about the dry form. And when the RPE atrophies, then the photoreceptors die. And unfortunately, neither the RPE or the photoreceptors are regenerative. In fact, they are markedly non-regenerative. So I just think of them, they're like neurons in the brain. In my view, they do not, we get one set, and they don't really come back. And so it is critical with these diseases that we prevent macular degeneration, just like we want to prevent heart attacks and stroke, for example, and Alzheimer's. All of these diseases, we want to prevent them because it's so much easier to prevent than to try to deal with them once they've already started. So we happen to be seeing a picture here where, this is drusen and the metabolic deposits that are so indicative of macular degeneration. And then you can go on to the wets. Here's the picture of the wet stage where Bruch's membrane actually fractures, that because it becomes calcified, it actually becomes brittle and it fractures. And the choriocapillaris vessels grow up through that membrane and beneath the retina, and then they leak fluid and bleed, and that's wet macular degeneration, and that's devastating. And today we use anti-VEGF drugs. We inject drugs in there to try to dry this up essentially and make those vessels regress. And that works well, and people should do that. But you want to prevent this disease, and it's preventable entirely with diet, with any version of ancestral diet. And we can talk about what that means.
Yeah, so you've got an area of the eye which is incredibly active, but basically relies on passive diffusion of the oxygen, because it's not very highly vascularized. Because if it was highly vascularized, the light wouldn't be able to be transmitted through it.
Right.
Have I got this right, Chris?
Absolutely.
And then as the vasculature starts to fail, just as any other part of the metabolism, you get inflammation, you get revascularization in a forlorn attempt to provide oxygen. And I think I'm right, Chris, these are the most metabolically active cells in the entire body.
Yeah, by far. The retinal cells are more metabolically active than any cells in the body, far more metabolically active than even heart muscle cells, because processing vision is an extraordinary task. So it requires an extraordinary blood supply. It may be tiny, but in terms of the amount of blood supply per unit area, it's greater than any part of the body as well. Again, because you need tons of nutrients and you need tons of oxygen and gas exchange in order to process vision. It is an phenomenally intensive job.
I think we've done a pretty good job of the epidemiology, put my teeth in. Mm-hmm. I think we should now talk about a bit more about the ascendancy of ultra-processed food. So it probably is partly about the sugar, I would argue, and certainly refined sugar.
Absolutely.
But we've seen this other dynamic with seed oils and what I call the trifecta of evil: sugar, carbs, and processed foods. Mm-hmm. And you can see how Weston Price fits in really neatly. And he was around, in a sense, fortuitously. He was still there at a time when all of this dynamic hadn't played out to the extent that it has now. And he was still able to go around the world and find the healthy people and what their diet was and what their lifestyle was.
Right. Exactly. Right.
And we've seen, and here we've got the ascendancy of chronic disease superimposed. It clearly is, there's sugar in there somewhere, but it's not as simple as that, is it? Because as you said, sugar's come and gone, smoking's come and gone. The one thing that's kept on going upwards is the vegetable oil consumption.
Right. Yeah. And I think people have misunderstood me when I present data, and if I present data on populations or just data, the fact that sugar is going down while obesity and diabetes and metabolic syndrome go through the roof does not mean that I'm exonerating sugar from being problematic. That is Weston Price's research, and sugar and refined carbohydrates, in other words, refined flours, essentially, those are nutrient deficient foods, and they contribute to nutrient deficiencies and degenerative disease. But my way I view my job is to try to figure out what are the primary drivers, and everybody wants to go for the low hanging fruit first, right? The Pareto principle. And I believe that you get 80+% of the benefit, maybe more, by doing one of correcting your diet by doing one thing, and that's to remove vegetable oils. But if you remove vegetable oils and refined flours and sugar and added sugars, that is, not natural sugars, but added sugars, for the enormous majority of people, you've almost completely fixed the diet. But to do that is a significant job, because you have to stop eating processed food. So, but yeah, sugar is part of the problem, and I'm not exonerating sugar from being problematic. It definitely, it's part of the problem, but it doesn't, except it is not toxic until the dose is very high. And that's, I mean, but I think it takes a very high dose, like they're using in animals. And most of these animal studies where they're testing sugar, they're using diets that are up to 60% sugar and even higher. So they're feeding animals sugar, and they're having them drink sugar water. And this is not indicative of any diet on the planet to do that, when you do studies like that, because Americans consume more sugar per capita than anyone in the world. And the last count, I think in 2010, was around 21% of the diet was sugar in recent years. And like I said, it's gone down. It did get as high as 27% in 1999 in the United States, but now it's down to around 21%. And but still, that's a fifth of your diet that is just nutrient deficient food, right? And so that contributes to this disease, but I don't believe it's contributing, even close to. I don't think it's even 1/10 the problem that the vegetable oils are.
So, I think we should talk about the red meat, right? Because according to the media, it's all about the meat. So clearly, we'd see a nice correlation, wouldn't we? Because we're eating more and more meat, that's the root cause, except perhaps not.
While we're on the subject, it's very interesting. We should discuss this first, and I'll come back to it. But yeah, so this is United States total meat consumption between 1800 and 2007. And this is an image that I think that is published in my new book, our new book.
Yes, yeah.
You can see that total meat consumption going clear back to 1800 was actually on the trend downwards, and actually hit its nadir, its lowest point in the 1930s. Yeah. And you can see that almost at the nadir is 1912 was when the first documented heart attack was. And then in 1930s, when we were at the lowest point of meat consumption, is when coronary heart disease became the leading cause of death. And people need to remember, we were pretty lean back then too. We were around 3 or 4% body fat in the United States. Yeah. And then you can see the meat goes back up, meat consumption goes up, and coronary heart disease goes up. But guess what? The same thing that's going up during this, as the meat's going up, is the vegetable oils. But you can see that this is a kind of a U-shaped curve over 200 years. We consumed about as much meat in the early 1800s as we do around 2000. And again, that's when coronary heart disease, and in early 1800s, when coronary heart disease was unknown and cancer was was very rare, or pretty rare.
So if the hypothesis of it all being about the red meat stands up, this graph can't possibly illustrate that. I mean, it completely drives coach and horses through it, doesn't it?
Yeah, let me mention this too. That this is why I laughed when you brought this up, because I was thinking about, we'd been talking about cancer as well, and what's driving cancer. Well, there's many studies of hunter-gatherer populations that have no cancer, and one of those, the first of those, to my knowledge, that was ever studied was by. I think his name is Vilhelm Stephenson, and he lived with the Inuit, what people used to have called the Eskimos, but he lived with the Inuit back in 1916, I think, for 2 years, and he lived in that frozen tundra in the Arctic Circle with them. And one of the things, he was an excellent researcher. One of the things he noted was that these people had no cancer. Cancer was unknown in their population. And yet they lived on they're the most carnivorous population that's ever been known, right? They live on meat. It's seal meat and blubber, whale meat and blubber, reindeer, caribou, and then fish. And for 11 months of the year, they absolutely cannot get any plant food. And yet, just as Weston Price showed them in the 1930s, they were very healthy people. They tend to be a little bit larger people, but perhaps they just carry a little more weight to live in the, maybe that's best for them to live in Arctic conditions.
The cold conditions.
I don't know. Yeah, but Stephenson, Vilhelm Stephenson came back to the United States, and he was so convinced by this. He set up, and he was a researcher, and he started a research went into a hospital initially in New York City. I don't remember which hospital. And he and one of his colleagues, they went on a completely 100% meat diet. It was the first meat, all carnivore diet ever studied. Yeah, and he did that in 1923, I believe. So it went an entire year and had no ill effects whatsoever, right? And now, again, I want to just mention, because people will take these things out of context and say, well, he's recommending an all meat diet. And that's not the point of this. Whether we're discussing vegan or carnivore or anything in between, I look at populations and evidence to derive conclusions about, because you can draw a lot of conclusions if you look carefully at this evidence. And so again, but the Inuit were cancer-free, and as I said, Weston Price showed the same thing. The Catawbans, Staffan Lindeberg lived with them for 6 weeks or so, but did a lot of study on the Catawbans in the early 1990s, and they had one possible known case of cancer. So again, and the Catawbans, they lived on So that's in the far South Pacific. It's, down by Papua New Guinea. It's Papua New Guinean territory, in fact. And the Catawbans live on coconut, fish, starchy tubers, and fruit. And so their diet was it doesn't have any processed food, right? Zero processed food, but it also had no vegetable oils, right? In fact, well, of course, no hunter-gatherers would ever have even a drop of vegetable oil. Where would they get it? Vegetable oils come from industrial manufacturing. I mean, they come from these huge plants that industrially produce. It's not easy to produce vegetable oils, but anyway, so yeah, so they're not a natural food, but.
And I think the broad point here is, Chris, that you can pick, as you've done, you can illustrate really healthy indigenous populations who are almost exclusively animal fat and saturated fat, and they were fit, lean, healthy. And you can pick indigenous populations who are an almost entirely carb-based diet, who are slim and healthy.
Right.
Conclusion is what? That Cubans can be perfectly healthy on a high-fat diet or a high-carb diet in the right circumstances. I mean, it's hard to escape. It's hard to escape that conclusion.
Yeah, whether the diet is 5% fat, like the Japanese and the Okinawans, 5% fat back in the 1950s, 1960, or whether it's 5% carbohydrate, and more than well, I guess we don't have any that are super, extreme, that high of fat, but you have the Inuit, I'm sorry, the Maasai that are 66% animal fat, right? And their diet is milk, meat, and blood, and they're fantastically healthy. The 66% animal fat diet, that's 40 to 46% saturated fat, animal fat, and they were fantastically healthy. And you have the Tokelauans that consumed 53% fat, most of that coming from coconut oil, but their diet is just the same as the Catawbans. It's coconuts, fish, starchy tubers, and fruit. And their diet was 50% saturated fat, and yet they had no heart disease, no obesity, no diabetes. Right. So it's not about the macronutrient ratios, really. And you can even look at the same thing, even with protein. The Papua New Guineans of Tukasinta consumed. They were studied by Sinnott and White back in the late 1960s, early 70s. Studied for 4 years. It was the most comprehensive hunter-gatherer study that's ever been done. And the Papua New Guineans of Tukasinta, they're highlanders. They live at like 8,000 some feet, and they couldn't hardly ever get meat. So they lived almost exclusively off of sweet potatoes. Their diet was more than 90% sweet potatoes. Their diet was 94.6% carbohydrate, 3% fat, 2.4% protein, they would rarely get pork, and very rarely chicken. So they'd have pork, I don't know how often, but not very often. But they would occasionally get some animal food. So there was no populations that are completely vegan in history, because they would die if they were unsupplemented, right? And but anyway, yeah. So these are extremes of diets, and we can learn from all of them. But all of these populations were healthy because they didn't have processed foods and they didn't have vegetable oils, and they had very low omega-6 consumption. Their omega-6. I've looked at many of these populations and these hunter-gatherers that are healthy, and even the other populations like Americans in 1865 and the Japanese in 1960, and all of the omega-6s under 2% of the diet, whereas today it's in westernized populations, it's about 7 to 12% omega-6 linoleic acid, and that's because of vegetable oils.
Yeah. So I want to talk now a little bit about what we've kind of mentioned. We've talked about the fact that these vegetable oils are nutrient deficient, but there's more to it, because they're also toxic, carcinogenic, proatherogenic. So I just thought we might say a little bit about mechanism, because the epidemiology speaks for itself, I think. But
Yes.
you've got to stand that up with some other science around the mechanism. In other words, can we elucidate a mechanism that explains this? Because if we can't, to me, one of the key stalls of planks of the argument fall at that point.
Right. Right. So for those who can see, we have an image here that shows that the vegetable oils are ultimately pro-oxidative, pro-inflammatory, directly toxic, and nutrient deficient. And I'll just go through these quickly. So pro-oxidative, well, oxidation is like the equivalent of rusting. And when you fill up your body with when you eat vegetable oils, and you will accumulate the omega-6 linoleic acid and the other types of fats in your body fat. That your body fat will reflect those. This will begin. The oxidation will begin a peroxidation cascade. And one of the things that happens here, this is a very complicated slide, but
we're not going to try and explain all the science behind this, Chris. Trust me.
I'll just do this quickly.
There are mechanisms. Yeah, go on.
Yeah. Just the main point is that vegetable oils and high omega-6, they drive mitochondrial dysfunction because they damage the inner mitochondrial membranes. And you can see that from this directly leads, when you have energy dysregulation and failure at the mitochondria, you have cellular failure on many levels. And the first thing that happens is increased reactive oxygen species and insulin resistance. But you ultimately get apoptosis, necrosis, nuclear and mitochondrial mutations, congestive heart failure, and that leads to virtually all of the chronic diseases are driven by that alone. And then the vegetable oils are pro-inflammatory. So this means that as you go down the pathway from omega-6 linoleic acid to arachidonic acid, the next metabolites of that are all pro-inflammatory, like pro-inflammatory eicosanoids, leukotrienes, thromboxanes, which are ultimately, they cause vasoconstriction, inflammation, and clotting. So that further contributes. And then you have the toxicity of the vegetable oils, which comes from the fact that when vegetable oils break down, this would be a different slide, but it doesn't matter, Graham, but the vegetable oils break down into lipid hydroperoxides, or I should say the omega-6 linoleic acid does, and into lipid hydroperoxides, which degenerate into advanced lipid oxidation end products. And these are chemicals like 4-hydroxynonenal, 4-H&E, malondialdehyde, MDA, carboxyethylpyrrole, acrolein, and then there's literally hundreds of others. So I tell people that when you consume vegetable oils, that this is literally like the equivalent of what tobacco does when you smoke it, is the fact, that when you smoke tobacco, it breaks down to like 6,000 chemicals, right? And when you oxidize it, essentially, that's what smoking is. It's oxidizing.
Yeah.
And the vegetable oils, the omega-6 linoleic acid does the same thing. It breaks down into hundreds of different chemicals. And these chemicals are cytotoxic, genotoxic, mutagenic, carcinogenic, atherogenic, thrombogenic, obesogenic, and diabetogenic. Could we get any worse? Now, this is are there any genics there that I left out? If there are, you could probably throw those in too, because this is so you put all this together. You're pro-oxidative, pro-inflammatory. That's the toxicity, and now you have the nutrient deficiency. The fact that they don't have any vitamins, no vitamins A, D, and K2, and when you supplant, your healthy lard, butter, beef tallow, coming from healthy animals, that is. With these vegetable oils, now you're also losing the fat soluble vitamins. Put all that together, and you have the recipe for disaster. That's how these work at the metabolic level.
I don't think I've got it here, but there's a fantastic slide in your book, and it's got two children of a similar age. Mm-hmm. One of whom's eating some lovely McDonald's French fries, and the other one's smoking.
Right.
And the damage is roughly equivalent, and you would argue the damage from the French fries is probably worse than the smoking. No one would let a small child smoke, but we're happy to feed them McDonald's French fries.
Right. And I think the damage is far worse by eating the French fries and by eating vegetable oils in general, because the vegetable oils will accumulate in your body fat, and for very long periods of time. The half-life is around 2 years. And that sets up this milieu, this biological milieu that is pro-oxidative, pro-inflammatory, toxic, and nutrient deficient, right? And so I make the argument that the smoking, which is pro-oxidative, can can damage you for up to a year about after you quit smoking. So if you smoked for 20 years and you quit smoking, that increased oxidation we know is gone within about a year. But after you stop eating vegetable oils, you still have increased oxidation for years in your body. There we go. So you're literally poisoned for 3 years or more, after eating this vegetable. If you cannot burn it that day, you'll accumulate it. And, so we look at this little child here eating French fries, and we think that's normal. And I tell you, it is so much worse than the little boy who's smoking. And so they're both bad, but we would think it's a crime to let your child, to suggest that your child smoke, right? But we feed our kids vegetable oils and French fries and all that, normally.
Yeah. And I say this frequently to clients, that if you have a sugar spike, it ain't healthy. And there are consequences in terms of insulin resistance, cell damage, glycated proteins, and all the rest of it. But that sugar spike is gone in an hour or two.
Mm-hmm.
Not healthy, but it's gone in an hour or two. Mm-hmm. The difference here is that these toxic oils accumulate in your adipose tissue and keep on accumulating. So it's a bit like, it is like the smoking, and the way I illustrate it is, like, if you say, like, I enjoy a cigarette and I smoke one a month and that's all I smoke, I'm not going to encourage you to do that. But truthfully, one cigarette a month isn't going to kill you.
Right.
Because it won't do sufficient damage. And the small amount of damage that one cigarette will do, the body will repair it. Mm-hmm. It's smoking a pack a day for 30 years that gives you COPD. That's what the evidence shows. The body has incredible healing powers. So it's the accumulated damage over 20 plus years, which is why smoking is going to kill you. And I would say that it's the accumulated damage of the seed oils, because they accumulate and they accumulate and they accumulate. And as you said, they damage your mitochondria. And the mitochondria are the fundamentals of metabolism. That's the energy or mechanism of it's how we generate energy.
Right.
And when we die, what do we die of? Ultimately, we die of the inability to produce energy. For whatever reason, that stops. And that's what death is. So you're in eating these toxic oils, in consuming these toxic oils that accumulate and accumulate, you're doing damage at the most fundamental level, and it accumulates over time. And you won't feel it. Not instantly, you'll feel it over 20, 30 years, but you won't feel it in the day like you do with the sugar.
Right.
You won't sense it on your continual blood glucose monitor, because as part of our program, everyone gets a CGM. You won't see it there.
Yeah.
So it's a silent killer.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And when people, I probably shouldn't even mention this, but when people are looking at their continuous glucose monitors, they're looking. To me, I'm not gonna say that they should never be used, but it's a very myopic approach to what is happening to you metabolically, and it's based only on your last food, your last meal, or whatever. It's not, and the reality is that the vegetable oils are accumulating in your body, And they're setting up this entire environment of insulin resistance, because that's what happens. And I've spoken about this way back at the beginning at the Ancestral Health Symposium in 2019, that vegetable oils are driving insulin resistance at the cellular level. And the cell is certainly the microcosm of the entire body. And so when you look at your food and you say, okay, well, I had a potato and my blood sugar really went through the roof for a few hours, I can no longer eat potatoes. I fundamentally disagree with that. That, you're looking only at what happened in that meal. You need to be looking at what you've done in the last 3 years. And because that's where the money is. That's where the health is. It's in what you've been doing for years, and it's about omega-6 level in your body. And by the way, I just want to mention, since we talked about smoking, is that, and I mentioned previously, the Catawbans, who again lived on, that were studied by Staffen Lindeberg back in the 1990s, and their diet was very much like the Tokalowans, coconut, fish, starchy tubers, and fruit. I think it was 80% of the women smoked and 75% of the men daily, long-term smokers. Almost all the adults smoke, and I think they begin smoking very early. They had no heart disease, and they had no diabetes and no obesity. And I don't remember for sure, but I don't. Oh yeah, I think they were also I think they had one known case of cancer, maybe a breast cancer case. So how is that? I don't remember them mentioning anything about COPD, emphysema, or lung cancer. I don't think there was any cases. And this is what you see it's because the Pacific Islanders have always been, there's a lot of smoking in those populations for many decades. Again, I don't think anybody should smoke, but it's incredible that,
very clear. Neither of us is arguing that smoking is a good thing.
No, I will argue
some context, right?
Yes. Yeah, it's definitely a very bad thing, but but you can correct a lot of these things essentially, with a very healthy, nutritious, ancestral diet that does not have processed foods and doesn't have seed oils.
So, Chris, I think we've done a pretty good exploration of this fantastic book. I don't know whether it's not showing very well, but I'll put a slide on actually.
Okay.
Tell us a bit, and there's all of this and more in the book. The book has got so much in it, we couldn't possibly cover everything. But tell us a bit more about how this book came to be, and where you can get it, and sort of next steps from here. And also, Chris, what does your diet look like?
Okay, sure. Yeah, so this is the book. It's called The Ancestral Diet Revolution. It is available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, basically most all of the major online retailers, I think now mostly around the world. We don't have the ebook out quite yet, but it should be within about a week. And eventually I hope to have an Audible version, but it's available in hardback and paperback versions. I mostly can be reached through Cure AMD Foundation, and we do have a second foundation, Ancestral Health Foundation, which does not have a website just yet. That's a newer one of our foundations, and that should be coming very soon. We have Facebook pages. So we do have social media, Facebook pages for both foundations, Cure AMD Foundation and Ancestral Health Foundation, and we have Instagram for those. So those are the main ways that you can follow my work, or on YouTube, lots of presentations and lots of podcasts like this one I'm doing with Graham today. And so those are the main ways that people can follow my work.
Chris, you're not going to make a...
I didn't answer about the diet.
Yeah.
I'll get to that.
Go on.
Oh, so did you ask what my diet is today, or what it is now, right?
Yeah.
So I would just say, first of all, my diet is ancestral. And I will tell people that I eat every kind of food there is pretty much. I mean, I eat, I mean, from American to Japanese, um, Chinese, um, French, Italian. Um, I consume only ancestrally raised meats, which means 100% grass-fed beef and bison, and I consume chicken that comes from animals that are not fed corn and soy. So these are ancestrally raised chickens, and their eggs too. Um, then these are hard to find. There's precious few farms that will raise their chickens right without corn and soy, and that's important because the corn and soy will drive the omega-6 higher. So I eat all those things. I am not low carb. I moderate carbohydrate, probably 40+% or higher, that comes from white potatoes, sweet potatoes, some white rice, some organic whole grains. I may have a little bit of issue with gluten myself, so I do eat some wheat, but not commonly. And then I eat various vegetables and various fruits. Let's see what else. That's right there, the staple. I do eat small amounts of organ meat, which is for me is primarily liver. So I consume probably about 2 to 3 ounces of beef or bison liver per week. So in other words, that's about a half an ounce to an ounce per day. And I also occasionally I consume some completely 100% grass-fed milk. So I use a lot of butter. Everything gets cooked in butter in our house, and I do consume some totally grass-fed milk, both bovine milk, cow's milk, in other words, and some goat milk. That's basically it.
So that's pretty comprehensive, isn't it? It's not like you're eating a narrow spectrum, is it? It's
Right.
pretty much it. Cool.
Right.
So, Chris, I would encourage people, if they can, to buy the hardcover version of this book.
I agree.
Because I was, delighted to be an earlier reviewer of this book, and it's just such a beautiful book, and it's an incredible tour de force of the world literature. I don't know how many hours you must have put into this, how many years of your life, but I have to congratulate you, on the sheer intellectual effort of this amount of research. I've had many people on the program, but very few have gone to the lengths that you've gone to research the entire world's literature on these various diseases. But also the way you put together such a beautiful book. It's rare in these days that a book is a thing of beauty. Mm-hmm. And in many cases, I would say, buy the paperback, read the PDF. But this is just a really elegant book as a book, and it's a pleasure to read. It's a pleasure to look at, and it just feels lovely to hold. I just have to congratulate you on an incredible piece of work here.
Thank you, Graham. I really appreciate it. Yeah, this was an immense amount of work, and I want to publicly thank my co-author Suzanne Alexander, who also put her heart and soul into this. 2 years worth of work on her part alone, and many, this is the culmination of really about 12 years of work for me, but really, 2 to 3 years of solid work has gone into this book. So yeah, it's been a long time coming, but we're very proud of it. And I thank you so much for your kind comments about the book, Graham. I really appreciate that.
Chris, is there anything, obviously we're going to come to a close now, is there anything that you want to add that I've failed to cover?
No, I think we covered really well. And I'll just make the point that, that eating right in today's world, it's not easy. It does take a lot of vigilance, and it takes some knowledge. You could look at it very simply. And I think if you just get vegetable oils out of your diet, that's the first step. You're 80% of the way there, in my view. But even that is not simple. So you need some knowledge about this. But remember that the life you save may be your own and your family members, by just by taking some very simple steps. And this is so dear to my heart because I've seen so much suffering in my lifetime that is a result of westernized diets, and it's all preventable. And that's why I'm so appreciative for people like you, Graham, that help us to spread this knowledge. And because I mean, you're very educated yourself, and you knew a whole lot of this, but to everybody who's helping to spread this message, I think needs to be congratulated too. So thank you.
I think so. And I think we should also clarify for the record that you're not making a fortune out of this, are you? Because you take no remuneration from any of these foundations that you're involved with.
Right. I decided back in 2017 or 2016 when I started going down this path that I'm fortunate enough to done some right things in my life, and anyway, so I don't have to. I don't take an income from this at all. In fact, I put my own money into these foundations. I believe in this. I want to reach people, and I want to change their lives, and I want to prevent suffering and prevent all this premature death, from our disastrous food supply. And it's just not that hard, for people who are willing to take some simple steps. You can do it fairly easily.
I think that's a great point to close, Chris. So thank you for your time, and thank you for the work that you've put into this. We really all appreciate it, and I think we can all benefit.
Thank you, Graham. I appreciate it so much.
If you enjoyed the podcast and want to find out more, join our Wellness and Prolongevity Facebook group. Don't forget to subscribe and follow so you never miss an episode, and maybe share to friends and family who might benefit. Finally, if you think you might need help with diabetes, heart disease, or any of the other diseases we discuss, then book a free consultation with Graham. There's absolutely no charge for this, and we would never put you under any pressure. What do you have to lose? Bye for now, and see you for the next episode.